1980, a teenager named Freddie Spencer walked into AMA Superbike racing with a factory Honda that made 130 horsepower. He had an entire engineering team behind him, unlimited money, and a bike that could hit speeds most riders had never seen. Meanwhile, in a small shop in North Hollywood, California, a 58-year-old man named Pops Yoshimura was grinding camshafts by hand. He had no factory support, no massive budget, and his bikes made less power than Honda's, but by the end of the year, his rider was champion. This is the story of how Pops Yoshimura beat everyone in 1980 by doing the exact opposite of what they were all doing. The 1980 AMA Superbike Championship looked like it was going to be Honda's year. They had just launched their first official factory Superbike program, and they weren't messing around. The team hired Freddie Spencer straight out of the novice class because even though he was only 18, he was already destroying riders with 10 times his experience. Honda built him a CB750F that made 130 horsepower at 10,500 RPM. That doesn't sound like much today, but in 1980, that was absurd power for a production-based bike. Everything on that Honda was hand-built. The camshafts were balanced by hand. The intake ports were shaped by hand. They even modified gold wing forks just to handle the speed. This bike was a weapon, and Honda wanted everyone to know it. Kawasaki wasn't far behind. They brought Eddie Lawson on a KZ1000 that made similar power. Lawson was already a proven winner, and the Kawasaki was fast in a way that made riders nervous. It was brutal. It wanted to kill you if you made a mistake. But if you could hang on, it was one of the fastest bikes on the grid. Then there was Yoshimura. No factory backing from Suzuki beyond selling them bikes. No team of engineers. Just Pops Yoshimura, his son Fujio, and a small crew working out of a California shop that looked more like a garage than a race facility. They were tuning Suzuki GS1000s, which were good street bikes but nothing special. Suzuki had launched the GS1000 in 1978 to compete with Kawasaki's big bikes, and it sold fine, but nobody looked at it and thought race winner. Except Pops did, because Pops had been doing this since 1954. He'd learned something that Honda and Kawasaki either didn't know or didn't care about. Peak horsepower doesn't win races. Torque does. And in 1980, he was about to prove it. Here's the thing everyone needs to understand about Pops Yoshimura. He wasn't just some random tuner. This guy learned metalworking as an aircraft mechanic in the Japanese Air Force during World War II. He watched pilots being welded into planes they weren't coming back from. After the war, he started fixing motorcycles for American servicemen in Japan because he needed work and Americans needed their bikes to actually run. That's where his philosophy came from. Those soldiers didn't care about peak horsepower numbers. They needed bikes that worked every single day without breaking. So Pops learned to build things that lasted. And when he moved to California in 1971, he brought that mentality with him. By 1980, he'd been tuning motorcycles for 26 years, and he'd figured out something that factory teams with unlimited budgets were completely missing. Everyone in 1980 was chasing peak power. Honda's engineers built an engine that made 130 horsepower at 10,500 RPM. Kawasaki did the same thing. The logic was simple. More horsepower equals more speed. Build an engine that makes maximum power at high RPM, put it on the track, and let the rider figure out how to use it. On a dyno, these bikes looked incredible, but on the track, they were a nightmare to ride fast. Here's why. Peak power at 10,500 RPM means the engine only makes that power at 10,500 RPM. Drop below 8,000 RPM coming out of a slow corner, and the power just disappears. The rider has to slip the clutch, manage wheel spin, and basically wait for the engine to wind all the way up before the bike really starts accelerating. And that takes time. Time you don't have when you're racing. Pops looked at this whole approach and thought it was insane. Races aren't dynos. Tracks have slow corners, fast corners, elevation changes. Riders are constantly braking, downshifting, turning, and trying to get back on the gas as early as possible. An engine that only makes power at 10,000 RPM is useless for most of the lap. What you need is power in the middle of the rev range. Power that hits hard at 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 RPM. Power that's there the second you crack the throttle open coming out of a corner. That's torque, and that's what Pops built. He didn't call it the Ultra Torque Special. That wasn't an official model name or anything Yamaha put on the brochure. It was just his philosophy. Build engines that punch hard in the mid-range. Make torque that riders can actually use in real racing conditions. And in 1980, he perfected it. So how do you build an engine for torque instead of peak power? Pops had his own way of doing it, and it started with camshafts. Most tuners in 1980 were using machines and computer programs to design cams. Pops used a bench grinder, oil stones, and a 360-degree protractor. He would grind a cam lobe by hand, measure it with a dial gauge, grind it again, measure it again, over and over until it matched what he wanted. The camshafts he made were completely different from what other tuners were using. Most race cams were designed for high RPM. long duration, aggressive lift profiles, peak power at 10,000 RPM or higher, Pops ground cams for mid-range torque, shorter duration, different ramp angles. The goal was strong, usable power from 6,000 to 9,000 RPM. That's the range where riders actually spend most of their time on a racetrack. He combined those custom cams with high compression pistons. The GS1000 normally ran around 9:1 compression. Pops bumped that up to 11.5:1 using custom pistons. Higher compression meant more cylinder pressure, which means more torque. Simple physics. He also hand-polished every port inside the cylinder head. Intake ports, exhaust ports, even the valve guides. Everything was mirror finished to reduce friction and help air move through the engine more efficiently. Then there was the exhaust system. And this is where things get interesting. In 1980, Pops invented something that would completely change how motorcycle exhaust systems work. He called it the cyclone muffler. Here's the problem he was trying to solve. Most 4-cylinders at that time used a 4-into-1 exhaust system where all 4 exhaust pipes merge into one collector. But the way they were designed, the exhaust pulses from each cylinder reached that collector in a random order. Cylinder 1 would fire, then cylinder 3, then cylinder 4, then cylinder 2. The pulses would crash into each other in the collector, creating turbulence that actually hurt power. Pops designed the cyclone system so that the exhaust pulses reached the collector in the exact same order as the engine's firing sequence: 1, 2, 4, 3. This created a counterclockwise flow inside the collector. That flow created a kind of whirlpool effect that sucked exhaust gas out of the engine faster and increased exhaust velocity. The result was a massive torque increase in the low to mid rev range, plus an extra kick at the top end. This wasn't some marketing gimmick. The cyclone muffler was a legitimate engineering breakthrough. And in 1980, it was a race-only secret that nobody else had. Pops would later sell them to the public, and they became one of the most famous exhaust systems in motorcycle history. But in 1980, it was just for his race bikes. When you put all of this together, custom hand cams, high compression pistons, polished ports, and the cyclone exhaust, you got an engine with a completely different personality than anything Honda or Kawasaki were building. Peak power was maybe 133 horsepower. That's basically the same as Honda, but where that power lived was totally different. Yoshimura engines made strong torque from 6,000 RPM all the way to the red line. Riders could short shift, run lower in the rev range, and still get violent acceleration out of corners. The power didn't wait, it hit immediately. Riders said it felt like the bike was trying to rip the track surface in half. That's the kind of power delivery that wins races. Pops' rider in 1980 was Wes Cooley. Now, Cooley wasn't a flashy rider. He'd won the 1979 championship by being consistent, not by being the fastest guy on the track. In fact, he didn't win a single race that entire year. He just finished on the podium in every single round, racked up points, and walked away with the title. 1980 started rough. The season opener was Daytona, and Cooley had mechanical problems. Freddie Spencer on the Honda finished second. Another Yoshimura rider, Graham Crosby, won. So the Yoshimura bikes were fast, but Cooley wasn't the one proving it yet. Spencer went on to win 3 races that year: Road America, Loudon, and Laguna Seca. He was fast, stupid fast for an 18-year-old. Eddie Lawson on the Kawasaki was right there with him. These were the favorites, factory riders on factory bikes with factory budgets. But here's the thing about Wes Cooley. He didn't need to be the fastest, he needed to be consistent, and that's exactly what the Yoshimura bike let him do. While Spencer and Lawson were fighting their high-strung, peaky engines that required perfect technique every single corner, Cooley was riding a bike that just worked. The torque was there when he needed it. The power didn't disappear if he missed a shift or got off his line a little bit. The bike was predictable. So race after race, Cooley finished second, or third, or fourth. He wasn't winning, but he was always there. Always scoring points, always consistent. And by the time they got to the final round of Daytona in October, he was in position to win the championship. He just needed to finish in a decent position. Then things got messy. Eddie Lawson's Kawasaki developed engine trouble before the race. It was running on 3 cylinders. The Kawasaki team panicked and pulled both of their bikes into the garage, Lawson's bike and his teammate David Aldana's bike. When Lawson's bike came out, it had different forks, different brakes, different handlebars. Even the Go 80 sticker that had been on the tail was gone. They'd switched bikes. Lawson was riding Aldana's bike with his own number plate on it. Cooley saw this on the grid and immediately protested to AMA officials. He told them this was happening. The officials ignored him. The race went ahead. Cooley finished where he needed to finish, but the Kawasaki team claimed Lawson had won the championship. Fujio Yoshimura, Pops' son, was furious. After the race, he confronted the Kawasaki mechanics in the pits. "We're gonna sue you. Be prepared," he yelled. The team filed an official protest with the AMA. It took until December for the AMA to investigate and finally rule. They confirmed the bikes had been switched. That was a clear violation. Wes Cooley was declared the 1980 AMA Superbike champion with 128 points, Eddie Lawson second with 121, Freddie Spencer third with 111. So Cooley won the championship without winning a single race. He won it with consistency, and he won it on a bike that made less peak power than Honda or Kawasaki but had torque that worked everywhere on every corner of every track. That's the lesson. Consistency beats speed when speed comes with complications. But the real proof that Pops' torque philosophy worked came 2 months before that Daytona controversy. It came at the Suzuka 8 Hours in Japan, which is one of the toughest endurance races in the world. The 1980 Suzuka 8 Hours was now part of the FIM Endurance World Championship, which meant factory teams from Europe were showing up. Honda brought works riders, Kawasaki fielded a full factory team. This wasn't some local club race, this was world-class competition. Yoshimura entered Wes Cooley and Graham Crosby on a bike called the XR69. It was based on the GS1000R with a Yoshimura tuned engine. Same philosophy as the Superbike motors, torque over peak power. The bike weighed 204 kilograms and made 134 horsepower at 9,500 RPM, with 72 foot-per-pound of torque at 8,000 RPM. Those aren't crazy numbers. Honda's RS1000 made similar peak power, but the Yoshimura had a broad, flat power curve. Torque was available everywhere. Over 8 hours, that matters more than anything. Honda's bike was fast in a straight line, but Freddie Spencer, who was riding for Honda that day, retired after 3 laps with electrical problems. His teammate couldn't even get out of the pits. Meanwhile, Crosby and Cooley just ran a steady pace for 8 hours straight. The GS1000R never missed a beat. The engine didn't overheat. The power delivery was smooth enough that tire wear stayed manageable. No drama, just consistent lap times. After 8 hours and 200 laps around Suzuka, Graham Crosby took the checkered flag. First place, Kawasaki finished second, 40 seconds behind. Honda France took third, 3 laps down. Yoshimura had just beaten every major factory team in one of the most important endurance races in the world. And they did it with a bike built in a California workshop by a 58-year-old man who ground camshafts by hand. The crowd that day was over 100,000 people. First time Suzuka had ever broken 6 figures for attendance, and every single one of them watched a small, independent team with no factory backing destroy everyone with more money, more engineers, and more resources. That's what torque does. It wins races when horsepower runs into problems. But don't think this was easy. Building these engines was brutal. The GS1000 camshaft was pressed together, not welded. At race RPM, the crank pieces would slip out of alignment. Most tuners welded the crank to fix this, but Pops refused. He believed welding changed the heat treating and made the parts brittle, so instead they just replaced crankshafts constantly. During the 1980 Daytona practice sessions, crankshafts kept breaking. Every single night after the track closed at 8 PM, Baggio and 6 mechanics would rush back to their motel room. They'd push the beds against the wall and turn the engine into a workshop. Then they'd stay up all night replacing broken camshafts, night after night. They were working on 6 superbikes plus a Formula 1 race bike. 8 machines total. Nobody slept. The clutch was another nightmare. Clutch plates would slip, warp, and break under the stress. At Sears Point, the clutch failed on Ron Pierce's GS1000 while he was leading his heat race. The bike just stopped pulling. Cooley's clutch lasted, but with 3 laps to go, the rear sprocket bolts pulled out of the magnesium wheel hub. He was leading. The bike rolled to a stop on the track. So Yoshimura installed a Suzuki 5-spoke magnesium wheel originally made for Barry Sheen's RG500 Grand Prix bike. The new wheel had more sprocket mounting bolts spread on a larger diameter. It also had a cushion drive built in. Problem solved. But they had to trim the edge of the rear tire with a razor blade just to get it to clear the chain. That's Yoshimura racing. Nothing was easy. Everything broke at least once, but they always found a way to fix it. In February 1977, a fire destroyed Yoshimura's entire North Hollywood workshop while they were preparing for the season. Pops suffered severe burn injuries. Most people would quit. Pops rebuilt the shop and kept racing. That was the kind of person he was. So why did torque beat horsepower? Let's break this down into simple terms. AMA Superbike tracks in 1980 had slow corners, fast corners, elevation changes, and rough pavement. Riders were constantly downshifting, braking hard, turning, and trying to get back on the gas as early as possible. A Honda or Kawasaki with peak power at 10,500 RPM required perfect technique. You had to nail your gear selection coming out of the corner. You had to brake at the exact right point. And when you got back on the gas, if you were below 8,000 RPM, the power just wasn't there. You had to slip the clutch, manage wheel spin, and basically wait for the engine to wind up before the bike really started accelerating. That takes time, and in racing, time is everything. A Yoshimura Suzuki with peak torque at 8,000 RPM and strong power from 6,000 RPM onward was completely different. You could short shift, you could run lower RPM, you could miss a gear and the bike would still pull hard. The power was there the second you cracked the throttle. No waiting, no clutch slipping, just immediate, violent acceleration that launched you out of the corner. This made Yoshimura bikes faster where it actually mattered, which is corner exits. Races aren't won on top speed, they're won on corner exits. A bike that accelerates harder from 60 mph to 100 mph will beat a bike with higher top speed but slower acceleration every single time. And over a 40-minute race, that advantage adds up. But here's the other thing. The torque made the bikes easier to ride consistently. Wes Cooley didn't have to be perfect with every gear selection. He didn't have to keep the engine screaming in the narrow power band. He could focus on his braking points and his lines instead of constantly managing the engine. That's why he was so consistent. The bike let him be consistent. Freddie Spencer was faster on raw speed, no question. But Spencer was also 18 years old riding a bike that required perfect technique in every single corner. One mistake and the Honda would bite him. Cooley's bike forgave mistakes. It rewarded smooth, consistent riding. And in championship racing, consistency beats raw speed almost every time. After 1980, the Cyclone muffler became famous. Riders wanted them for their street bikes. Pop started producing them for the public, and they became one of the most successful aftermarket exhaust systems in motorcycle history. The design hasn't changed much in 45 years. It still creates that counterclockwise exhaust flow. It still increases torque in the low to mid-rev range. People are still buying them today. But the full philosophy took longer to catch on. Factory teams kept chasing peak horsepower through the 1980s and 1990s. They had the budgets to build engines that made 150, 160, 170 horsepower. They believed raw power would eventually overcome any disadvantage. Yoshimura kept winning anyway. Wes Cooley won back-to-back championships in 1979 and 1980. The Yoshimura-Suzuki partnership continued for decades. Riders like Matt Ladin and Ben Spies won modern championships on Yoshimura Suzukis. The bikes got faster and more sophisticated, but the core philosophy stayed the same. Build mid-range power. Make torque that riders can use. Don't chase dyno numbers that don't translate to lap times. Pops returned to Japan in 1981. His son Fujio took over the American operation and brought more organization to what had been a grassroots race shop. Fujio started using computers to design cams. In 1980, he bought a Hewlett-Packard HP41C programmable calculator, which was cutting-edge technology at the time, and wrote programs to calculate cam profiles. The same calculator was being used by Japanese self-defense force pilots. Fujio used it to design the camshaft that powered Wes Cooley's championship. That combination of Pops' hand-ground intuition and Fujio's computer-aided precision created engines that were both powerful and reliable. Other teams had bigger budgets, but Yoshimura had something more valuable: decades of experience and a willingness to do things completely different than everyone else. The Suzuki GS1000 became legendary because of what Yoshimura did with it. Suzuki launched the bike in 1978 as a competitor to Kawasaki's Z1000. It was a good street bike, fast enough, handled decently, but there was nothing special about it. Just another Japanese four-cylinder from the Superbike era. Then Yoshimura got hold of it and turned it into a winner. The 1978 Suzuka 8 Hours, the 1979 and 1980 AMA Superbike Championships, multiple Daytona wins. The bike proved itself in the hardest conditions against the best competition in the world, and riders discovered something else. The GS1000 engine was nearly indestructible. The bottom end with its roller bearings could handle abuse that would destroy other engines. The overhead cam design was simple and didn't break. Yoshimura race engines regularly ran entire seasons without needing rebuilds. That durability came from Pops' conservative approach. He didn't try to extract every last horsepower. He built engines that would survive 8-hour endurance races and still made strong power at the end. The result was reliability that other teams couldn't touch. Even today, Yoshimura GS1000 race bikes are valued by collectors. These weren't garage queens, these were working race bikes that won championships, and the fact that they're still around after 45 years later proves how well they were built. If you want more stories about the builders and racers who changed motorcycle by refusing to follow the rules, subscribe and hit the notification bell. And drop a comment. Tell us which underdog racing story you want to hear next.